Wave World and Caustics can both be found under the simulation category, and these are two pretty complex effects, so this is definitely going to be a longer video. And these two effects were really created for each other. One is to generate a distortion map, and the other one is actually generating that distortion. So let's walk through what I've already set up. I created this comp to look like the bottom of a pool, and all of that is contained within a pre-comp. We don't really need to go through any of that, but I've pre-composed it all so it all exists on one layer. I also have a photo of some clouds in the sky, as well as another pre-comp with my logo in it that's just white over top of a black solid. And we'll get to that much later. But to start all of this out, I need to make a new solid to apply these effects to. So I'll go up to Layer, New Solid, and click OK, and I'll rename this one Wave World, and then I'll duplicate it and then rename that Caustics. And we're gonna start with Wave World. So I'm gonna solo that layer and apply the Wave World effect to it. Now, like I already said, this is the effect that's going to generate a distortion map that we can then apply to our comp using the Caustics effect. So this is actually what's doing the water simulation. And if I play through, with the default settings, we get this rippling over top of this mesh. And that doesn't do much for us in this current state because we're viewing it as a wireframe preview. And this is just to get a good visualization of what our distortion map can do. If I pause it just right about here, I'll go into the wireframe controls and we have horizontal and vertical rotation. So I could rotate this around in 3D space to get a different view and just see this from a different perspective. This white mesh right here in the middle is the actual wave simulation. And then we have a floor and a ceiling to that simulation. So basically anything that goes beyond that floor or ceiling is going to be clipped out. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to switch my view from wireframe preview to height map. This is what we're ultimately going to want. You can see right in the middle of the frame, this is 100% white, and that's what I meant by clipping. And since this is going to be a distortion map that Caustics will be taking advantage of, anything beyond that ceiling gets clipped off and is lost. It's information that the effect can't actually use. And the same thing goes for the floor. If we go back to the wireframe preview, if anything goes below that floor, like right there, it's going to be clipped out in black. So unless you want that clipping, your goal should always be to keep your wave simulation within the ceiling and the floor. And we can actually make an adjustment to that very simply. If we go into the height map controls, we have brightness, contrast, and gamma adjustments. If I go back to my height map, it makes perfect sense. I can brighten this up, I can increase or decrease the contrast, as well as make any gamma adjustments if that's something you need. And if I switch back to my wireframe preview and increase or decrease the brightness or the contrast, you get a really easy to understand visual of what that's actually doing. So I can basically raise and lower that floor and ceiling with the brightness and increase or decrease the depth using the contrast. But we could actually just make this less dramatic too, so it's not going beyond that floor or ceiling, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I'm gonna skip over these other properties in here for a second, collapse these up, and we'll move on to the simulation. So actually, let me reset these wireframe controls back to their default angles. And there was one more property right here that I skipped over. This is just the vertical scale. Doesn't actually change anything about the simulation. If I go to my height map, see it's not affecting the image. It's purely the preview, just being able to see more or less of that wireframe within the view. So let me reset that, close that up, and then we'll go to the simulation category. The grid resolution is what controls the mesh count or how many polygons are in our distortion mesh. So 40 is not particularly high of a value, but it renders really quickly. If I increase this up to say 150, my mesh gets much more fine and has a lot more fidelity to it. And I would generally work at least this resolution when you're simulating something as complicated as fluid. Now this next property, grid res downsample, actually decreases your mesh count depending on how you're viewing your comp. So I'm set to full resolution right now, but if I switch this to auto, it's going to scale it down to half because I'm at 50% magnification. Or if I zoom out even further, it's now quarter. This grid res downsample is going to cut the resolution of my grid by that same factor. So it's taking 150 and giving me a quarter of that resolution. I would not recommend working this way. That's why I had mine set to full, because it drastically changes how your simulation looks. So I would say leave it at full and go ahead and uncheck grid res downsample just in case. Next up is wave speed and damping, and these two are pretty important because the combination of these two values is really what determines how thick or viscous the fluid is that you're simulating, as well as how large the body of fluid is. So think of this in terms of a glass of water versus a pool of water. When you have much more surface area, those waves are going to appear to be traveling much slower. And because there's more water to deal with, those waves are going to travel a lot further. But in just a glass of water, there's far less surface area, and those ripples are going to be bouncing off the edges of the glass and interacting with each other a lot more quickly. Another thing to think about is how thick your fluid is. Water is obviously very thin liquid. Things pass through it really quickly, whereas honey or paint is a lot more viscous. You can't really go swimming through honey. And if you drop something in a bowl of honey, there probably will be ripples, but they're going to not travel very far before completely being eliminated. And that's what the damping property is for. So if I increase this value a lot, you can see that the ripples are not traveling nearly as far anymore. I'll just play this back. And you see that they're kind of phasing out before they even get to the edges of the simulation. I could increase that a lot more and turn the wave speed down even further. And now they're really phasing out. Or I could go in the opposite direction. I could turn the damping way down and turn that wave speed pretty far up. And now my simulation is producing waves and ripples that are just going all over the place, completely beyond the mesh that's sized to my comp. So again, I could switch to my height map and we see those ripples traveling outwards as if they keep going beyond my comp. So those are two properties that you really need to get familiar with if you want to be able to control what type of liquid you're trying to simulate. Next up is reflect edges, and this is going to allow the ripples to bounce off the bounds of your comp. So if I switch this from none to all, and then play this from the beginning, you see the ripples travel out, hit the edges, and then bounce back. Now my damping is super low, so I'm gonna just increase that a little bit, and you'll see that they don't travel quite as far, but they're still bouncing off those edges. But I don't have to choose all. I could choose any combination of these options. So if I only wanted it to bounce off the left edge, I could do that. Maybe I need to turn my damping down so it doesn't die out so quickly, maybe turn the wave speed up. But there you can see it's bouncing off the left edge and none of the others. And that can be very powerful. I'm gonna set that back down to none for now. And the last property in this section is pre-roll, and this is measured in seconds. And this basically allows you to start the simulation prior to the start of the comp. When this is set to 0, it's starting right at frame 0. But if I turn this up to say 3 seconds, then the simulation has already been running for 3 seconds by the first frame. So if you wanted those ripples to already be happening at the start of your comp, that's exactly how you would do it. I'm gonna reset that back down to 0. And before we go into any of the other controls, I wanna show you how this is now applied through the caustics effect. So I'm gonna unsolo this layer, go to my caustics layer and apply the caustics effect to it. And there are 3 main sections to caustics that we need to pay attention to: the bottom section, the water section, and the sky section. The most important is the water section, because this is where the distortion is actually generated from. We need to choose the water surface to be the Wave World layer. Again, it's in this state, the height map, that shows us this grayscale image. So I'm going to choose that layer, Wave World, as my water surface and change the source to using effects and masks so that it can see that effect on top of that solid layer. And now we're getting something that looks a little bit more like water, but that's just the first step. We also have a bottom section and a sky section. So the bottom is defaulted to the layer you've applied it to, but you can choose any other layer. So I'm gonna choose the pool floor, and it will bring that layer into the caustics effect as the image on the bottom of our water simulation. So back at the beginning, it looks just like our unaffected layer, but if I play this back, immediately we see this really great looking wave simulation, complete with lighting, distortion, refraction, all being generated by that grayscale height map. And the third section, which isn't as important of caustics, is this sky section. And this allows us to put a reflection in our water, basically. So I have, again, this sky layer with just some clouds in it. So I'm gonna choose that as my sky source. And now clouds are showing up in a reflection. It's a little difficult to see, but if I turn up the intensity, you can see they are there. Now that actually takes a lot of detail out. So I'm actually gonna just leave that off for now. I'll close that up and we'll just focus on the bottom and water sections. So let's look at the rest of the controls for the bottom. First of all is scaling. This is set to 1 by default, meaning it is unscaled, but I could scale it up or scale it down and it will tile that texture. And we can also change how it's tiling. Currently it's set to reflected, but we could just straight up tile it or not tile it at all. Now I don't need any tiling, so I'm gonna set that back down to 1. The next section is if layer sizes differ, then center the layer or stretch it to fit. Now I've made all of my sources 1920 by 1080, so they're the same size as the comp, and I would suggest that you work that way too. But if you don't mind things being stretched or not aligning perfectly, then you can use this control to handle that difference in size. Next is a blur value. If I zoom in nice and close and increase this value, we're going to just blur that background layer. And that's separate from the surface water section. Again, I don't really want any blur, maybe just a slight 0.25 since it is underwater, but I don't want to lose too much detail of my pool layer. That's it for the bottom section, so now let's look at the water section. Here we have controls for how to interpret that height map that we made with Wave World. So even though I can control the simulation's height right here in Wave World using those brightness and contrast controls, I could also go into the caustics effect and control the wave height right here. So if I increase this value, we're gonna get a lot more refraction, and it's going to make those waves appear as if they're taller than they were. Or I could turn that way down and will be a much more subtle ripple throughout the entire simulation. I'll reset that back down to its default. And next up is smoothing. So if I zoom in again, nice and close, and turn that smoothing down to say 0, our ripples get very sharp. There's not much of a transition between the crests and the troughs of those waves. So smoothing is definitely a good thing, and we could crank this up much higher and those waves are going to get much smoother. So default was 5, but I could increase that much higher and you can see how that's really smoothing out the ridge there. So that's 5 and this is at 31. All right, I'll turn that back down to 5. Next up is water depth. So this is going to give the appearance of the water being much deeper. And that's actually something I want since this is supposed to be a pool. So I'm gonna increase that water depth. Again, I'll reset that down to its default and then undo to get back to where we were. So now those waves look like they're much further away from the bottom of the pool. Next is the refractive index, or index of refraction. This is a value that every surface has. Different materials have different index of refractions, and you can actually look these all up online. So I just Googled water IOR for index of refraction and immediately got the result, which is 1.333. So I'm gonna change that refractive index to 1.333. And now the refraction that's happening throughout this distortion is going to be much closer to actual refraction of water. But this value changes depending on what material you're trying to simulate. Glass is 1.5 to 1.7, diamonds are 2.418, and these are not numbers that I've memorized, I'm just looking at a chart off screen. All of this information can be found online. So if you're trying to simulate coffee or honey or something other than water, you can go search that on Google and type in the refractive index right there. Next is surface color, and this is basically a tint for the liquid. By default, it's this bluish color that gives the appearance of water. I'm gonna make it a little bit more teal, but you can change this to any color that you want. Click OK. Next up is surface opacity. So this is basically how murky the liquid is that you're simulating. So if I turn the opacity all the way down, it will be crystal clear. It's like water that has absolutely no impurities and no influence on the colors of what's underneath it. And if I increase that, it gets thicker and thicker until I get all the way up to a value of 1, where we don't even see the bottom layer anymore. This is now basically just being rendered on top of a solid based on that surface color, which is something you might want to do, so it's worth knowing about. But I'm going to turn that opacity way back down so that this looks like pretty clear water. I think the default was 0.3, so I'll just leave it right there. Next up is caustics strength. And you can kind of think of this like the highlights and the shadows of these caustics. It does not take much for this to be noticeable, and the default value is 0. So if you want to add a little bit extra punch to your caustics, give a little bit more to the highlights and shadows, you can turn that up just a little bit and it will make a big difference. You don't really want to go very high because you're going to start turning into something like this, unless you're trying to go for something that's much thicker of a material, like say mercury, where it's an extremely reflective liquid that you don't really see through at all. I'm going to dial that way back down though, because I don't want this to be very noticeable. I just want a little bit of a punch to those highlights. All right, so that's it for the water controls. Let's close that up, go into the sky section, and I'll select that sky layer one more time. Now that does wash everything out a little bit. So if you want to have a reflection, you might need to play with the intensity, or I could even add some color correction to this, maybe add a curves effect, go back into my caustics and make sure it's looking at the effects as well, and then just bring down the overall brightness of the image. This way I'm isolating more of the clouds and not having the sky flood out that reflection too much. So if I turn that layer off and back on, you can see that now it's pretty much just the clouds appearing in the reflection of the water. Now I'm going to go to a section where it's distorted, where we can see this cloud nice and clearly. And the next option is convergence. In fact, let me turn up the intensity a little bit so we can see that really clearly right here. And convergence is basically how far away the reflection is. In this case, it's the sky, so it should be very far away. And at a max value of 10, it really adds a lot more distortion to those clouds. If I turn that down to 0, it's going to have the opposite effect where it's not distorting much at all. So play around with that value to get something that you're happy with. I'm going to reset it back down to its default. And then jump back up here to show you that we also have scaling for the sky, just the same way that we did for the bottom. We can change the repeat mode or how to handle different layer sizes. Now, I do think that's a little bit distracting. I don't necessarily need that reflection of those clouds, so I'm just going to turn that off. And that way we can focus more on this distortion on top of that bottom layer. I may have made the depth of the water a little too extreme, so I'm going to go back to the water, change the water depth down to say maybe 0.46. I think that looks a little bit better. All right, next up is lighting and material. So let's go into the lighting section. And this is how the highlights and the shadows are being generated on top of the distortion. The light type by default is set to distant source, and you can kind of think of this like the sun, something that is very far away. Using this point control for light position, we can kind of place where we want the sun to be. So if we wanted to be off to the side, if you're imagining looking down at a pool like this, we'll push the sun over there. But then we can also control the height. So if I put it down to a low value, that will be like the sun low in the sky. Or if I put it all the way up to a value of 5, then it's going to be directly overhead, and it doesn't really matter where the position of that light is anymore. But I'm going to put it over here to the top left and turn that light height down a little bit, not too far, maybe just around 0.7. And I can also control the light intensity. If I wanted more light, I can increase that, or less light, I could decrease that value. I'm going to leave it at the default for now. We could change the light color. If I wanted it to look a little bit more like a sunset, I could add in some color to that. Maybe just a little bit of orange. And then finally we have ambient light. If I turn this all the way down, you can see that it just takes out some overall brightness. If I turn that up, it's going to uniformly increase the brightness of everything. So again, I'll leave that at its default and maybe increase the light height just a little bit. So that's distant source, but I could change this to point source. And then this is going to be something much more like a light bulb. So imagine I have a light bulb that I'm moving around the surface of the pool, or if I put it right in the middle, it's going to emanate outwards, but we still have these other controls. So if I put it right here and I increase the light height, then it's going to be as if it's shining straight down. A lower angle is like I'm turning a flashlight basically to be pointing outwards. Again, we can increase or decrease the ambient light, as well as increase or decrease the lighting intensity, and that can give a very cool effect. Finally, we have the ability to choose the first comp light. So if I were to add an actual light into my scene, I'll make it a point light, click OK, and go into my caustics and change it to first comp light. Now that point light is going to be driving the lighting of my scene. So let me back this up in Z space a bit until we can see that light. And I can move it around and you see that reflection within that distortion. I can increase or decrease the brightness just like normal. And the benefit of this is that these lights are also going to interact with other 3D objects in my scene if I have any. I lose the ability to control anything about the height or the color, position. All of that is now controlled with the point light, but I can still increase or decrease the ambient light within my scene. I could also change the light type from point to parallel, and now it's going to be much more like that distant source light. So I could bring that light a lot closer to the surface, move it over to the side, and it's going to behave a lot more like the sun for any 3D objects in my scene. All right, I'm going to get rid of that light, change my light type back to distant source, and get this looking the way that I want it. All right, I think I'm happy with that. Now let's go into the material section. This is where we can change how the light is being reflected off of our surface. So we can control the diffuse reflection, which is kind of like an overall reflection for the entire material. We have specular reflection, which is the highlights, or how shiny or glossy those reflections are, as well as the highlight sharpness. So if I turn this up, it's basically adding more contrast to those highlighted areas. And again, different materials have different properties, so you're going to want to dial that in based on what type of fluid you're trying to simulate. I'm going to reset these back down to their defaults, and that's basically it for the caustics effect. But we can do a whole lot more with the Wave World effect now that we've dialed in the look of our water using the caustics effect. So I'm going to jump back to Wave World, and I'm actually going to solo this layer and change it back to the wireframe preview. I'm going to collapse up the height map controls as well as the simulation controls and move down to producer 1. When I play this back, we've just got this rippling happening right in the middle of our height map, and it's just continuing on forever. This is being generated by this producer 1, but we can completely change the way that this simulation looks. So let's walk through the controls for this producer 1. By default, it's set to the ring type, but I can change this to line. And if I rotate the wireframe around a little bit, you can see that it's no longer circular. It's a line that's being stretched up and down. Those are the only two types you can choose, but you can do a lot with them. Next is the position. By default, it's centered in the layer, but I can move this around and it's going to change the origin of that simulation. So if I grab this and move it in the top left corner of my comp, it'll start in the top left corner of my mesh and come out from that corner. And that can be animated. So we could very easily tie this with expressions to another layer to animate it or even parent other objects to it. And we'll get to that a little bit later. For now, I'm going to reset that back to its default position. Next is the height or length, depending on what type you've chosen, and the width. It's set to 0.1 by default, but that's actually pretty large. If we go to the beginning, you can see that initial diameter of that wave is pretty big within the comp, but let me just switch this to height map so we can see it from straight on, and I'll increase that height. You can see that that just stretches it out vertically, and the width will stretch it out horizontally. So I could turn this down to 0.025 on the width and the height, and it's going to be a much smaller point of distortion for those waves to come out of. Or I can make it much wider, and then it'll be an oval instead of a circle producing those waves. Next is the angle. So I could rotate this. It doesn't have to be perfectly horizontal or vertical, and that's something that I could animate as well. So if I set a keyframe there and then go forward a second and rotate this backwards, then it's going to produce waves based on that animation. Maybe that was a little bit too fast, so I'll back that up a bit and then play it again. You can see that that is an animated source now, or producer, generating those waves. Let me get rid of those keyframes and reset that, as well as the width and the height. And next up is the amplitude and frequency. Amplitude is basically how high those waves are, or how intense the waves are. So if I go to a point where it's at its highest and I increase the amplitude, you see that that just brings the highest point higher and the lowest point lower. So that's the intensity or the height or depth of that wave. And the frequency is how many of those waves are being produced per second. So it's set to 1 by default, meaning 1 per second. But if I turn that frequency down to 0.5, then it's going to move slower and produce waves slower. Or I could change that frequency up to 2, and it's going to produce waves much more quickly. Now, if I pause it right about here and look at the next property, phase, I can control where the starting point is. So it doesn't have to start right where it always does in that simulation. If I just dial that in a little bit, it's going to start at a different position when that simulation is first run. I'm going to reset that back down to its default. And those are all of the controls for the producer. So what can we do with this to make something a little bit more interesting? Well, right now it's just a regular pulse or being driven by that frequency and amplitude. But I could turn the frequency all the way down to 0, and now it's not going to continue to produce waves. It's basically just going to give an amplitude for that wave, which I can control with the phase to go downwards or upwards. Remember, this is a ring shape. That's why we're getting this shape. And maybe I'll scale it down a bit. I'll go down to 0.02 on the width and the height. And my simulation got really weird. I'm just going to change the phase a little bit until I get something that just looks like a little dimple into the mesh. And initially we're going to get a ripple, but then it's going to stop moving because my frequency is set down to 0. From here, I could animate the position to generate waves in this mesh. So let me switch back to my height map, and I'm gonna make a new null object, layer, new null object, and I'll name this 0.1. And then press P to bring up the position, and start an expression on that position property by Alt or Option clicking on the stopwatch, and then use my expression pick whip to grab the position of 0.1. So now wherever 0.1 is where the position of that producer 1 will be. So I'll move it to the, say, top left corner and set a keyframe. Then I'll move forward, we'll say 3 seconds, and drag this point down here and maybe give it a little bit of a motion curve, as well as easing these keyframes so that they're nice and smooth. So I'll ease out and in to those 2 keyframes, and then play this back so we can see how it is now traveling along with that point. So now the waves are being produced by something moving through that mesh rather than something being oscillated up and down throughout the mesh. And because it's being driven by a point control, I could parent something to this and it will move with that layer and appear to be generating those waves. So let me unsolo those layers and preview the caustics version of the simulation so we can see those ripples traveling through the water over top of that background layer. It looks pretty great, but I could say grab my logo and drag it out, scale it down, and then parent it to that 0.1 and move it right over top of those ripples. And I'll even go ahead and enable the motion blur for that layer, and it's going to now appear to be producing those ripples. And let's say they don't really like the way that that ring is always dimpling in the water. Well, I could go back to my Wave World simulation, change the phase maybe back down to 0, and that's producing some really strong clipping. So let me go to my wireframe preview, and that seems to have really distorted my mesh. So I'll probably turn the amplitude way down and rotate my view so I can see how tall that is. Looks like it's not going to clip now. Unsolo that layer, make sure to change that back to height map, and then play this back one more time. So we're still getting that ring. So what I would probably do is keyframe the amplitude from this point to the end of the animation. So set a keyframe right there and go forward to 3 seconds and turn the amplitude down to 0. And that way, by the time it comes to rest, there will be no dimple in the water. So let's play that back and see how it looks. As it starts to slow down, those ripples become less and less, and there's no dimpling left in the water. Now remember, I can go back into my caustics effect at any time, go into the water and maybe change the wave height a little bit, increase that smoothing a bit, and really dial this in to look exactly the way that I want it to. Now let's say that I want to make this look a little bit more like an actual pool. Well, I'm going to select everything in my scene and pre-compose it by going up to Layer, Pre-compose, and I'll call this Simulation. Then I have another layer that I'll bring out that's called Pool Edge, and then just move my simulation down into the right to kind of align that to the pool edge. And if I go back into my simulation pre-comp and into the Wave World effect, I'll go back to my simulation and say on the reflect edges, reflect on the left and top. So now this simulation is going to appear to be bouncing off the left and top edges of the pool. So let's play this back and see what it looks like. So much more realistic waves now bouncing off of the edge and the top. And I think that looks pretty cool. Now I could always add, say, a drop shadow to that pool edge, drag it out, make it a little bit softer and tint it this bluish color, maybe make it a little bit darker, and then maybe duplicate that one more time, offset the distance, offset the softness, and turn that opacity down, maybe on both instances. And now it just looks like it has a little bit more depth. Now, I don't really like the way that these waves are taking so long to die out at the end. I think it's just taking a little bit too much time, and while it might not be realistic, I want to control that a little bit more. So I'm going to jump back into my simulation, into the Wave World effect, and turn up the damping a little bit. Remember, that's the value that helps the waves die out more quickly. So if I play this back within here, those waves are not going to travel as far before they kind of dissipate and turn back into flat water. And maybe turn the wave speed down a little bit. I could also animate the amplitude on as that point starts up. So let me press U to bring up those keyframes. And let's say the amplitude should be at its strongest at this point. So I'll set a keyframe there, then back it up to where it just begins to move, which is frame 0, and I'll turn that amplitude down to 0. So now that amplitude will build as the logo starts to move, and then die off as it comes to a rest. Now, I still want to increase that damping quite a bit so that the ripples disappear at the end, but I don't want to go so far that it looks like it's a much thicker liquid than it actually should be. And back out in this comp again, it looks like it's bouncing off the edges of the pool. Now, there's actually a second producer within the Wave World effect, and it's by default set to an amplitude of 0, so it doesn't affect anything, but this is exactly the same as producer 1. It's just giving us a second point control. If I increase the amplitude up to, say, 0.5, then it's going to have a second simulation running. In fact, let's just switch to our wireframe preview and change the angle a little bit. And you'll see that now we have the 1 point moving around and a second point right here, which I think I need to make that amplitude a little bit more strong to be able to notice it. but something like that is now in the bottom left corner, and it's producing waves throughout the entire scene. Now this could be interesting because I could combine the two to make water that looks like it was already rippling while having my logo interact with all of those ripples. So let me switch to my height map. I'll change the width down to being something much smaller, so it's more like an oval, and I'll have to dial back that amplitude a little bit so it's not so extreme, and then push it to the top left corner of my comp. In fact, I could even go back off the comp a little bit. And to generate those waves before anything happens, I'm gonna go to my pre-roll and increase that up to say 3 seconds. Now I have waves already rippling out from the top left corner of the pool before my logo moves through it. And now that I think about it, it probably wouldn't make sense to have it on the edges that are supposed to be the edge of the pool. So I'm going to actually move that producer 2 down to the bottom right edge of my comp. And I'll change the angle just a little bit, maybe turn that width down even further. And maybe I'll increase the frequency of these ones to be a little bit higher. I'll unsolo that layer and we can see that now there are ripples coming from the right side of the pool, and the simulation of producer 1 moving through those waves is going to interact very realistically. It's a very powerful system and produces some pretty incredible results. And putting it all together, it looks pretty convincing. Now, obviously, there's an endless amount of tweaking that you can do to this to dial it in exactly the way that you want, from the lighting to the depth, to the colors, the thickness of the liquid. But there's one section that we haven't really touched yet within Wave World, and that's the ground section. So let's solo that Wave World and switch to the wireframe preview so we can see what the ground actually is. It's this green mesh at the bottom. If I move the height of that up or down, you can see how it moves up and down in our preview. What this is going to determine is how close the ground is to the actual wave simulation. So let me rotate this so that we're looking at it pretty much from the side, and then move that ground mesh up. As I get closer to the actual surface of the water, my waves get shallower and shallower. So it affects those waves very directly. But it doesn't have to be used as this flat mesh. In the instance of this pool, it does make sense because the bottom of the pool would be flat. But I can actually choose a ground layer for that floor. So I'll switch back to my wireframe view and choose my ground map as the ground layer. Remember that ground map is just my logo on top of a black solid. White represents the highest point of the ground map and black represents the lowest point. So again, I'll rotate this around so we can see it very clearly, but it's taking the shape of my logo and extruding that out from the ground mesh to give a shape to that ground instead of it just being perfectly flat. And like I said, that directly affects the water simulation. So let's switch this back to the height map, and you can kind of see my logo poking through here and the waves interacting with that. Now, back in my wireframe preview, we have the steepness control, which is basically how steep that white portion of the ground map is, as well as the height. So I can shift the whole thing up and down, or I could just increase or decrease the steepness of that map. So I'll turn that steepness down low and I'll bring my ground up pretty high so that it's much closer to the surface of the water. And I'm gonna turn the steepness all the way down to 0. And then I'll go forward in our simulation after my logo stopped moving, and I'm going to keyframe the steepness from 0 up until a point where it's poking through the surface of that water. Press U to bring up those keyframes and just ease them. And then switch back to my height map and play that portion back. So my logo pops up and we have some waves showing up underneath it. But I can make those waves even stronger if I increase the wave strength. So let me turn that up to a much higher number. And as this pops out now, we're gonna get much stronger waves. And I can make this even more extreme if I make that animation happen more quickly. And obviously this can be anything you want. It doesn't have to be a logo. I could go into the ground map and type out no swimming. Make sure that's pure white and increase the size. I'll turn off my logo and center this up. And now that text is going to be what pops through the surface of the water. And if I unsolo this, we can see how it's affecting the overall simulation. It's obviously a little bit difficult to read, but if you just added in that ground map, I'll duplicate it, bring it up just above caustics, turn it on, and then change the blend mode to say screen and turn the opacity down quite a bit, then we'll see that a lot more clearly. Now I could synchronize the opacity of this layer animating on with the steepness being animated as well. So I'll just set some keyframes here turn the opacity all the way down on that text, and now it fades on at the same time that it ripples out. Unfortunately, Wave World does not support animation within a ground map. It just takes the first frame of your pre-comp. So I couldn't animate this text and have it generating ripples in this scene. Just something to be aware of. Now there are two last controls for Wave World that we haven't looked at yet, and they're within the height map controls section. And those two properties are render dry areas as and transparency. So let's solo this layer and talk about what dry areas are. If we switch back to the wireframe preview, dry areas are basically where waves or the liquid wouldn't be touching, right? The dry surfaces. And because we're poking this text through the mesh, any part of that ground layer that's going through the mesh is a dry area. And by default, it renders that dry area as a solid. So we're getting solid pixels within that dry area. But I could change this from solid to transparent, and then it's going to poke through with actual transparency, which may be beneficial if you're trying to use this as a matte for another layer, but you want to use the alpha channel and ignore all of the other grayscale values. There's also the transparency slider, which if I turn it down or up, it's basically like a threshold for how much of that simulation should be transparent. So it doesn't take much to get more of the image than you probably want to become transparent. So I'll reset that back down to its default of 0.01. This isn't something that I actually need, so I'll turn that back to solid. But with that, we've covered all of the controls of both Wave World and Caustics and how to get them to work together to create something very specific. These are incredibly powerful effects and definitely deserve some time to just experiment with and see what you can come up with. I hope this walkthrough helped you. If you create something with either of these effects, be sure to comment below and share a link so that we can check it out. But that should get you started with Wave World and Caustics. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.